Hello, welcome to FA.B projects and its webinar. I'm Laura Panella from CIDIS, and FA.B is an AMIF project, a European project called FA.B, Family-Based Care for Children in Migration, and is aimed at supporting the improvement and the expansion of alternative family-based care system for unaccompanied migrant children in 5 European frontline Mediterranean countries. We've had a first webinar yesterday that focused on the best interest of the child and the right to be heard. And we've heard about, of course, the how to operate in a child-friendly way, and procedures and tools available for practitioners, and a child-friendly communication to adopt and different strategies we can refer to when working with accompanied migrant children. Today, we're going to be hearing more about unaccompanied migrant children in Europe and migration routes. We have invited Mr. Daniel Redondo, who's a senior regional migrant protection and assistance specialist from IOM, International Organization for Migration. Welcome, Daniel. He will be telling us more about, of course, who are these unaccompanied migrant children, migration factors, risks they face during the process, the migration process, new routes of migration that are opening in the latest developments, and with a special focus on what we can do as practitioners in dealing with this specific target. So with no further ado, I would like to call Daniel to introduce him to his work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura and Valeria, and thank you also the FA.B project for this invitation. And a warm welcome and good afternoon to all participants. It's a pleasure to be here today. What I would like to do for the for this session today will be to share with you some general principles and some general elements to the discussion around unaccompanied migrant children in Europe, starting with some recent development and some general reflections. And towards the end of the session, we will have an opportunity to also hear your questions and your views. So feel free to write already any questions or any points you may want to address. And at the end, again, we will cover them. So let me start very quickly with a quick overview on some of the questions that I would like to cover through this session today. So first of all, which are some of the latest trends in the field of migration when it comes to unaccompanied or separated migrant children in Europe? Who are they? Do they have any specific profiles? Why do they migrate? Which are some of the risks they face in countries of destination and countries of transit? Thinking a little bit more about the perspective of the project and overall the activities that, at least from an IOM perspective, we carry out here at the regional office in Brussels. What type of actions can we promote to support their most basic rights and most basic needs? And what can you and I already do based on the work your organization, your institution is doing? So let me start very briefly with a quick overview for those who may not be familiar with the work of the International Organization for Migration. Sorry, just to say that the organization was established in 1951 and it's part of the United Nations system, being the leading intergovernmental organization in the field of migration. And we work with different partners, including states, migrants, and civil society. So we have a membership of around 174 member states, and also 8 states holding observer status, and offices in over 100 countries. And we are dedicated to promoting humane and orderly migration for the benefit of all. Now, IOM works to help ensure the orderly and humane management of migration, to promote international cooperation on migration issues, to assist in the search for practical solutions to migration dynamics, and to provide humanitarian assistance to migrants in need, including refugees and internally displaced persons. And within this group, we also work assisting migrant children, particularly unaccompanied migrant children. Now, the work that the organization carries out, it's in line with international human rights law and international relevant principles, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also regional frameworks, such as the case of the Council of Europe and EU relevant instructions and directives. And overall, the work when it comes to migrant children is guided by the principles that I'm showing on the slide. So I'm not going to go in detail on each of them, but just refer to a few of them. So first of all, non-discrimination, and this is particularly relevant when we talk about the protection of children in the context of migration. So children are children first and most, and regardless of their migration status, they are entitled to, and they should be afforded with the human rights protection. And again, without discrimination, also on account of their ethnic, religious, and or any other inherent characteristic. So this is just to highlight a little bit how these principles translate into practice. The best interest of the child, which I will not go in detail because this has been covered, and the principle as well of evolving capacities, which is extremely important. For those of you who may not be familiar with this principle, this is a principle that is enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and basically remind us that, well, first of all, the children, they are agents who are in a stage in their lives where they are growing, and they are acquiring new learning, new skills, new knowledge that shapes their understanding of the world. So this is why we need to understand in that part of the evolving process, which they are constantly undergoing, that their view of the world, their understanding, the participation, the work that all of the actors in this field should carry out when working with them, should understand where they are in this process of life. So that means, for example, that the needs of a child may be different from one to the other, even if they have the same biological age, and or depending on whether they have migrated or not. So it's really about understanding that evolving capacity and evolving understanding of the world and maturity, that we also need to be mindful of the specific assistance that is being provided to them. And the last point that I wanted to briefly highlight from these principles is the principle of participation, which continues to be an essential element for all of us working in this subject. Reason being, once again, that it's not just a right that children should have access to, the participation to any type of direct decision, and they should be voiced and be provided with a voice to be part of those decisions, but also in terms of any policies and any structural changes that might have an impact on them. And I think, at least from the experience of our organization, this is also something that we need to adjust in our programming, and I think others as well, particularly from very pragmatic elements, such as ensuring participation, now in the context of COVID, through virtual means, in a manner that also does not risk their safety. But this is just one example of how we also need to translate these general principles into practice. So that was very briefly about the organization, but I will be happy to answer any questions you may have towards the end. The other point that I wanted to mention very briefly is a few statistics and a few information on the status of unaccompanied migrant children based on the latest information we have from 2020. And this is part of an ongoing effort that the organization conducts together with our UN partners as well, UNHCR and UNICEF, in a document that it's called the trends, an overview of trends of the situation of refugee and migrant children in Europe. Now, very quickly, a few figures that I want to share with you, and certainly you can find more information on the fact sheet that we can share with you. Is first of all the information we have from last year, and if we look into the countries, some of which are also part of the FA.B project, so we have that arrivals in frontline states in the southern and eastern part of Europe in 2018 accounted for 16,700 children who have arrived based on the information that we have. And this represents half of the number of children who arrived in 2019. So we see a decrease of arrivals, and we see some similar trends. For example, that the vast majority of them are boys, but there's also, of course, a representation of girls with, of course, a specific needs and a specific elements that we need to consider, and we will expand later on in this session. Also, just to share with you very briefly that the arrivals of unaccompanied migrant children in between January and December 2020, out of the group that I have mentioned before, 62% of those arrivals were unaccompanied. So that amounts for around 10,300 children. So out of the figure of 16,000, almost 2/3 actually are unaccompanied children. So this also highlights an important element about the profiles and how children are migrating when they come to Europe. Looking slightly at the country focus, and I will be sharing 4 examples, we see similar trends. So without being exhaustive, in the case of Italy, some 6,252 children arrived in 2020. And of these, 75% were unaccompanied or separated children. And I will explain later what do we mean by the concept separated children. The majority of these children, they originated from Tunisia, Bangladesh, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea. When we look at the trends in Malta, some 6,108 children arrived following search and rescue operations at sea. Of these, 88% were unaccompanied or separated children. So you see the similar trends that we have also presented at the global level in all of the various frontline countries. The majority of children who have arrived in this period in Malta are coming from Sudan, Somalia, and Bangladesh. Now, let me share the focus on Greece and Bulgaria. In Greece, 4,000, and sorry, apologies for the typo, 4,600 children, 602, arrived by land and sea, out of which 82%, there was a decrease, of 82% compared to the previous year. However, the trend remains the same. There's, of course, presence of unaccompanied and separated children. In the vast majority of them, they come from Afghanistan, the Syrian Arab Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, and Iraq. Last, Bulgaria, with some 1,122 children who have lodged asylum applications in 2020. And out of this group, 70% were unaccompanied or separated. And most of them are original from Afghanistan, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Iraq. And this is just a quick overview of the data that I have previously shared, just for you to also see on the blue side, those children who are unaccompanied. So that means they're traveling with families and or a member of their family or a relative. And the pink part is to highlight as well that the vast majority, with the exception of Greece, in the period that I have mentioned are unaccompanied or separated. So this is also just to highlight the relevance of the group. Now, let me move forward very quickly, just to show a little bit on the nationalities of origin. So as you can see, on the left-hand side, countries such as Afghanistan, Syria, but also Tunisia, Bangladesh remain on the top of where the UMCs are originating. And the vast majority, traditionally, of countries where they have migrated or transited to are Greece and Bulgaria. But also, of course, we see Italy this is a trend not recent, but for quite some time, and Spain as well. And basically, I think it's important to also recognize that when it comes to geographical roots, there are, if I can use the word, traditional roots, but there are also so traditional roots, for example, from West Africa towards the Canary Islands, following also specific moments of the year. For example, during this period, we tend to see an increase on the number of arrivals. This has to do not just related to a number of factors at origin, but also the conditions at sea. We see the similar situation in the Mediterranean, and we see this similar trends as well in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So there are also different elements just to add to the discussion on how the children are migrating, following either regular or irregular means of entry. Now, when it comes to the breakdown, when it comes to gender, as I have advanced briefly before, the vast majority of unaccompanied or separated children, they come from, or they're boys with a very few girls present. In most of the cases, in other cases, such as the one in Greece, they tend to follow similar trends. However, what it's important to recognize with this slide is the fact that migration is also shaped by gender. So that means the reasons why men and women, boys and girls migrate, and persons of diverse gender tend to be also shaped by these societal expectations based on gender, for example. How also, and the experiences they face through migration are also shaped because of the gender, in even amount to specific episodes of violence and abuse that they might face. So this is also just to highlight very briefly as part of the overall snapshot on the situation of UMCs. Now, very quickly, just to start wrapping up on some of this preliminary data that I wanted to share with you. When we have conducted interviews with the migrant children and the asylum seekers, so we often find quite a number of important details that are important to mention, and some of them have to do with what I briefly mentioned before about how they have migrated and which are the routes that they use. So this is why sometimes we have found a very, I would say, evidence on the fact that there are these traditional routes in focus, but sometimes we may have also routes that have been used from very distinct places. So just to give one concrete example, we have found also routes that change constantly. In children, for example, who have arrived via the Western African route, the Western Mediterranean route in Spain, coming from places such as Comoros, for example. So that would be on the other side of the southern east side of the African continent. We have found also in that Western route individuals from Afghanistan. So this also just to highlight again that it's quite diverse, the dynamics of migration and the routes that are being used, but also the stories they have, because oftentimes what they have reported is that the motivations they have also shapes a little bit the process and how they're able to migrate. So just very briefly on this end, some of them we have found out that they have, for example, in this case, on this data conducted in 2020, that almost half of them completed primary education, while another 16% reported to have finished lower secondary education, and 1/5 of the respondents have reported that they have never gone to school. But this is also to maybe share some other anecdotal data, that we also have seen cases whereby we have children, for example, who have completed their education, no, at the secondary level, and again, part of what we already see as part of this understanding of who they are is what can be provided from this angle, from the destination countries, and how that type of support can be shaped. And this is what I would focus a little bit later on, but this is also to highlight the relevance of data and understanding as well the profiles of who are the UMCs. Now, data also that we have available and that we can share briefly with you is about the migration journey. So some have reported, for example, that they have spent more than 1 year in Libya, some 2 to 3 years on average before crossing the Mediterranean route, the central Mediterranean route. So as I mentioned before, a majority have traveled without a family member. Some 43% of those who we have interviewed, they have cited economic reasons as the primary motivation for leaving their country of origin, followed by limited access to services, being subjected to threatened or personal violence, or they have faced personal violence, and the presence of conflict or war. Among the reasons, they have also mentioned to us family disputes and violent episodes at the family and the household level have also pushed them to migrate. And many of them, when we have a first interaction with them, their most immediate needs in terms of support have been identified as, again, any other individual related to close legal assistance, ability to contact their families in origin or even in destination, because even if they migrate by themselves, sometimes they may have family members in Europe, so they need to get in direct contact with them as soon as possible. Medical and psychosocial support is part also of the profiles. Now, if we look into the international protection perspective, in 2020, we have a report of around 428,945 new asylum seekers. Out of this total, 134,800 were children, so nearly 1/3 of the total number that I mentioned before. And 13,550 asylum applications were launched by unaccompanied children. Also, just to highlight the numbers. And the majority, or the 4 top countries where they have launched requests for asylum are Germany, followed by France, Spain, and Greece. And this also just to show that, again, as part of the dynamics, and I'm not going to get into the specific Dublin procedures and the specific procedures that are launched after an asylum application, but this is also just to highlight that, for example, in the case of Germany, sometimes it's not just about how they migrate to get to Germany, but sometimes it's also how they arrived in Germany without being, let's say, having any type of direct contact with authorities before. This is the similar case in France as well, just also to show and highlight some of these dynamics. And as I mentioned before, either because they travel without a family member or they want to reunite with a family member. So these are also part of the motivations why or how they migrate to a country further beyond the border. Now, on the applications of asylum, the vast majority of applications launched in 2020 were coming from nationals from Syria, followed by Afghanistan, Iraq, and Venezuela, Colombia, and Eritrea with a 4% each. The data that we have for 2021 shows some slightly similar figures, and we keep monitoring the situation when it comes to developments around Afghanistan, particularly as you might have heard on the situation that has arisen over the past few months. However, it's too early to come up with a specific statistics, but what I can certainly share at the moment is that asylum applications have increased over the past 2 months, and this is a trend that we continue to see. after the lockdowns that were placed through COVID during the COVID pandemic. The similar trends when it comes to gender are those of unaccompanied migrant children when it comes to the gender of the applicants. The vast majority are applications launched by boys with 54%, followed by girls with 46%. And last on this point, and slightly beyond the topic itself of international protection, when we talk about unaccompanied migrant children, and when we talk about also the dynamics of migration, we also need to understand the element of trafficking and smuggling. So I will not go into detail about these two different crimes. However, what I want to mention at this stage is that unaccompanied migrant children, they may also migrate and become victims of trafficking, either from the start of the journey or through transit or destination. They may use as well as smugglers. So the data that I'm sharing with you is the data collected by the European Commission in the years 2017 and 18, where 8,310 children were trafficked into the EU. So I don't have the specific breakdown of how many of them were unaccompanied or unaccompanied or not, but it's also just to reflect this dynamic. Children accounted for almost 1/3 of all registered victims in the EU. The majority of them were trafficked within the EU, and they were EU citizens, mostly trafficked within their own country. 41% of the trafficked children were non-EU citizens. The majority of the victims in the EU were trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation, and 16% in the EU for forced labor. And the vast majority of child victims registered were girls, and followed by boys as well. Now, I'll stop with this data, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview of some of the most important trends and some of the important dynamics to flag when it comes to migration and the specific issues that are related to unaccompanied migrant children. As I mentioned, some of these, the numbers, of course, they come with the specific challenges about migration routes, how children are migrating, the challenges they face, et cetera, et cetera. These are evolving concepts and evolving trends, let's say. We may see, as we have seen over the past decade, in the past decades as well, that there are specific peaks, there are specific ways on how we can see different migratory flows. At this stage, just to give a concrete example, and without going into a lot of detail, we see also some different routes being used, for example, by Lithuania, Poland, and Latvia. So this is a dynamic that is not completely new when it comes to what has happened. What is somehow different and has changed over the past few years is the number and the influx of arrivals, and also specific challenges that are completely, let's say, difficult to absorb when it comes to the protection of the individuals who at this moment are entering via those routes. So this is also just to shape to this type of the discussion. Dynamics as well that we see, and again, I was covering more from the perspective of the FA.B countries, but also the southern, west, and east Mediterranean route. But we can also see the challenges as well linked of the migration of UMCs from France, Belgium, towards the United Kingdom, using Calais, but also using the coast and the shores of Belgium. So these dynamics, again, are quite complex and quite diverse. We saw it as well from influx coming from South America, for example. So just to add again to the let's say, exhaustive list of rationales and non-exhaustive list of challenges that UMCs may face. Now, please feel free to write any questions you may have on the chat or any comments, and later on, towards the end of the session, we can certainly engage in a discussion with you. Now, COVID-19, as I mentioned briefly, has already added a number of challenges for all of us, but also for UMCs when it comes to the specific areas of protection. So just a few very concrete details that we can share. For example, the increase on the use of traffic search for child pornography. So let me just share very quickly a slide here with you. And this is this has been provided by Europol on the situation of exploitation and the searches of child abuse materials in the internet, coinciding with the breakout of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So in around March and April 2020, as you can see, there was an increase on the online searches of child abuse materials. No, so we can see it also in this slide very quickly. So this is information that we can share, but it's also confirmed by other resources. And why are we sharing this information linked to the topic of UMCs? Well, because of course, in the context of understanding the dynamics of the motivations of UMCs and their migration, we have to understand as well that all of these issues have an impact. We see it particularly in the field of trafficking of children, how an important number of children are unfortunately trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation in the format of or through child pornography means. So this is just to add to that condition. Now, the increase of socioeconomic disparities in general is also an effect that has led also and continues to motivate the reason why UMCs migrate. The inequalities also in accessing other services, such as medical support, but also education. The work of the trafficking networks, as I mentioned very briefly, and how they adjust, unfortunately, their modus operandi very quickly. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, this is also something we saw, unfortunately, that even though international borders were closed in most countries, they were able to find other means to either traffic children, but also smuggle UMCs and smuggle migrant children in general and their families. So these are also the linkages that we can already start looking at when looking at the subject as such. The inequalities in access and education, and I'm sure you can probably mention a few others that have an impact as well on the situation of UMCs. Now, when we talk about unaccompanied and separated children, so the first one of the questions that come to us is why do we speak about these two subjects? And also we need to start drawing a bit of differences about the terminology itself. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the two concepts, I'm sharing on the slide the definitions that are taken from the General Comment number 6 of the Committee on the Rights of the Child on the treatment of unaccompanied and separated children outside their country of origin, which has been translated as well into regional and national frameworks. So at regional framework, for example, at the EU level. The first part of the definition is about who are unaccompanied children. So unaccompanied children, also called unaccompanied minors, are children who, as defined in Article 1 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so again, those 18 years of age and below, have been separated from both parents and or relatives and are not being cared for by an adult, and who by law or custom is responsible for doing so. So in the context of migration, this means, again, a minor who has crossed an international border and is not migrating with any family member or parents, with the parents, not with family members, with the parents, or anyone who is overlooking after their guardianship. Now, when it comes to separated children, we're looking into a slightly similar case. So by the definition on the screen, these are children who have been separated from both parents or from their previous legal or customary primary caregiver, but not necessarily from other relatives. So this may be, therefore, include children unaccompanied by other adult family members. So this is why it's important also to stress the definition. But overall, because in many documents, you most likely will see the use interchangeably of these two subjects, but we need to be mindful as well of the specific similarities, but also differences. Now, if I would ask you at this stage, which is the profile of a UMC, I hope that by looking into the information that we have shared at the beginning, we can come to the conclusion already that there is not a unique profile. So unaccompanied migrant children have common needs in terms of realization of human rights, such as the ones that we all have. However, they have specific needs and different ones. They have specific profiles and characteristics. So these may be shaped, for example, not just by the intersection of being migrant, but also if they have a specific gender, if they are part of a specific ethnic group, whether they have a disability, they come from a specific religious group or practice, and or any other characteristic that might add to their unique needs. And also, as I briefly mentioned, the differences in the needs of those who have or are about to transition to adulthood. So they are in the period of being at the age of 15, 16, 17, may be different from one case to the other. That depends, of course, a lot on the evolving capacity and where they are, maturity, etc. But also, that might be different from those who are at an early stage. And I think this is also just to highlight that there's not, it's important to keep in mind this element because sometimes from a programming point of view, having this understanding may help us also better shape the type of programming that we do and we conduct. Why? Just to give one concrete example, sometimes by lacking that understanding that the needs of those at a certain age might be different from those at an early stage, even though they all fall under the definition of children, means that tailored assistance is being provided as if they were in a unique trend, if they would be all part of the same group. And this is why we talk to some UMCs age 16, 17, and they basically don't want to be part of specific services that are being provided to them because they feel that they're, let's say, not tailored to their needs. They're basically extremely loan to what they need. They prefer, for example, and they feel more independent at that stage. So they want services that take into account that level of independence. Let us also remember that migration itself is a process of learning, whether or not it's a positive or not so positive experience for many of them that shapes also to their lives. What they have encountered through the migration journey builds one way or the other the way they see the world, how they trust or not the authorities, how they see assistance. We have to also think about their countries of origin, what type of experiences they may have in relation to the authorities themselves. So all of these elements come into place in relation to that specific assistance and understanding their needs, particularly for those in the process of transitioning to adulthood. Now, on the reasons why do they migrate? Well, as we have seen, there are multiple reasons, not excluding, but war and violence is one of them, to reunite with family members abroad, to seek better economic and educational opportunities because they have faced violence, abuse, exploitation, including by family members, and others that may not fall necessarily under specific schemes of international protection. So here we are highlighting a few that might have let's say, an implication when it comes to international protection, but some others they don't. Some others, again, may be quite a number of reasons and rational. So at the end of the day, there are multiple reasons. So, and that's what it's important also to keep in mind. Now, which are some of the key instruments of international law governing the protection of UMCs? And some of you may be familiar with one of the most relevant. So I would like you maybe to just reflect very briefly. But the International Convention on the Rights of the Child is, of course, the one that comes often in our minds. So this is what we call by the acronym CRC, but we can also mention other instruments such as the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, the International Covenants on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We can also, of course, mention the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At the international level, and staying in that path, the criminal law instruments, such as the Palermo Protocol, that recognizes, of course, the dimension of transnational movement, including of children as being a vulnerable group. When it comes to the regional dimension, we can look, of course, at the Council of Europe and EU relevant directives, many of them that are basically shaped by these international developments as well. And also at the level of national laws. So that's also an important part to consider. Now, this is about the framework, and this is about the structure. So this is about how states should act, what are their obligations, what are their commitments, and as we also understand, there are other actors that have a commitment. And we discussed it much more, even in the past few years, about the responsibility as well as all of us. So I'm just giving one example. When it comes to corporate responsibility of the private sector, but also of consumers themselves. And why am I making this connection? I'm making this connection because, as I briefly mentioned before, oftentimes children may be trafficked and they may end up, again, forced to work in a specific activities that may be linked to supply chains that use trafficking as one of the means to exploit them, but also obtain profit and benefit. So this is, again, how we need to start connecting all of the various dots in relation to the needs of protection of UNCs, not as an isolated issue that happens only at borders or that happens when they launch an international protection request or an international protection mechanism, support mechanism, but in general, how this also translates into many different elements, which at the end of the day, many of actors, we have a responsibility to work on. And this brings me also to the following point, which is about programming itself. So I was talking, and I've been moving from the understanding of a snapshot, understanding the international framework, understanding a little bit who are they, what are the type of the profiles. Now, when we start digging into the programming, and when I use the word programming, I talk about interventions that different actors conduct when it comes to supporting their most immediate needs in the migration journey, including at countries of transit or destination, but also state-led organizations, for example, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Interior, civil society organizations that also have a role to play, the private sector, etc. So for us to start thinking about programming, one of the points where IOM tries to work with different partners, and one of the principles that also guide our work is understanding the risk that migrants who are vulnerable and subject to violence, exploitation, and abuse, and in our case, UMCs, they face looking at their social environment. So for those who are working, who are social workers, I think this concept somehow resonates to their work, but basically programming starts by understanding and having the individuals at the center of the discussion. So in this case, the UMCs. So the model that I'm sharing, on the slide, basically what help us to shape is that understanding of programming that we need to target interventions at the individual level. So looking at the needs, in this case of the UMCs, as I mentioned, they were different. At the second pillar, without any specific order, to look also at the household and family conditions, because they may have a risk either on how and why they have migrated and or at the country of destination, what are some of the risks that they may still face. at the community level as well. So we all live in a community environment, we all live and interact with individuals. So in that interaction, we may be exposed also to a specific risk, including at countries of transit and destination. And again, just to highlight that the challenges that UMCs face do not finish when they have arrived in a country of destination. And last but not least important, the structural level. And the structural level is that high level, let's say, whereby we need to look into the policies, into the legislation, into the structural elements that cascade down and have an impact, but also they may pose a risk for UMCs. Now, in these 4 different levels and in 4 different pillars, I want to just quickly focus our attention. Because once we start the programming to work with UMCs, we need to start from different parts, and one of which is identifying the risk. And the risk can be identified throughout the migration journey. But let us focus very quickly on the slide on the risk that they may encounter in transit and destination. So they may encounter themselves, if they are UMCs, that they do not have a family. Let me actually pose this for the following, but in their individual scenario, the conditions that had originated their initial migration may continue to exist. So if let's say, left my country because of violence at my house, and I continue to face this in the country of transit or destination, well, this is one of the risks that we will need to address, no? The lack of access to fundamental rights at the housing, education, health. So this is an issue that happens across the board in many countries, including in Europe. They may be still exposed to violence, exploitation and abuse, to poverty and trafficking. So these are the type of risks that they may continue to face at the individual level. At the family and household level, the lack of having a guardian, the lack of having immediate support, mechanisms of support, but the lack also of, for example, they may still live in environments where there's abuse of drugs, of substance, for example, where their families, or not their families specifically, but their most immediate network of support may also not have access integration services and integration opportunities in the country of destination. So there's also a lack of access to prospects of integration. There's a stress around that. Sometimes UNCs may be placed in specific systems whereby they may still, again, have some support from a legal perspective, but they may not be, let's say, contacted or provided with the relevant guidance, with the relevant support. So in theory, they have a guardian, in theory, they have a legal representative, but in practice, the elements remain there for which they continue to face risk at being exposed, no, to different elements. At the community level, they may still face risk when it comes to racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, or other discriminatory practices. At the community level perspective, also lack of mechanisms when it comes to language support, vocational training, lack of access to effective services. And when I use the word effective, this is one big challenge because sometimes the services may exist. However, how the services are being provided become bottlenecks, and they may have specific obstacles. So one concrete aspect is the cross-cultural dimension. So that means that even if we have excellent services, information printed in a flyer, or we have videos, etc., if they don't take into consideration the cross-cultural dimension in the understanding that many of the UMCs, they come from different cultural environments. So most likely we will not have the direct and intended impact that we would like to have. So this is just to flag again that even these elements become, again, a risk when it comes to protection at the community level. And last, on the 4th pillars of the interventions and how we want to start framing programming is the structural level, no? So by not having policies or by not having legislation and or by not having policies or legislation that responds to the challenges that they face, well, we again are oftentimes placing the UMCs at risk. So this is also an important consideration to take into account. So this happens in various ways. Again, the legislation may be also enabled, but not necessarily responding to the current dynamics and the current challenges that the UMCs face. So this is often also what we hear from our counterparts when it comes to even themselves being limited by the lack of having legal mechanisms that would support the assistance that they're providing. So this is just one example. Misleading information in the news, in general, in media, particularly by fake news or by sometimes, in very unfortunate, sometimes we have seen reports by media that tend to criminalize how UMCs have arrived in Europe. What are the rationales? What is their motivation? Sometimes, and again, I can talk about this topic in more detail, but even in a specific actions such as establishing the age assessments and also the determination of age, which oftentimes, and again, there are different layers to this point, but oftentimes when UMCs arrive, there is no proof about their date of birth, certificates, the exact age. No, there are no means, material means to prove their age. So states, and that's their prerogative, and there's nothing internationally against this, they conduct age assessments. But when these assessments are conducted, we need to be mindful of a number of principles that need to be followed. And those principles in general means that children should be treated in full respect of their rights. Therefore, these assessments should not be conducted in a way that interferes with their dignity, their safety, should not again affect their integral, dignity. So sometimes, unfortunately, we see that these age assessments are conducted by, for example, one example could be looking at genitals. There's no explanation, there's no process being followed. And even if there's a process followed, we know that, for example, from a forensic perspective, specific procedures will not tell you the exact age of the child. And in some cases, even some medical procedures, they have been proven to have specific failures. And when I use the word failure, is basically that there is a gap or there's a period of time. So just a concrete example, bone testing, for example, has been proven or has been used in some contexts as a mean to prove the age of a child. But even the outcomes of a bone testing may differ with the actual age for around 3 to 4 to 5 years. So they're not entirely accurate. And again, I think experts on the subject may explain a little bit better than me. But what I want to highlight is that age assessments, in this case, they need to be conducted in a proper manner, looking into other means of proof, having the benefit of the doubt, etc., etc. And going back to the point of media, I have seen articles, for example, where it has been mentioned, well, in this child or this individual claimed to be a child, and therefore turn the story against the individual. So again, I can expand a little bit on this subject. What I want to highlight is also the relevance and the importance to make sure that we work against this type of misleading information and provide the caveats about what exactly is the situation and what exactly are the issues at stake. Now, this point that I just mentioned starts also connecting us, not just on programming, at the analyzing the risk factors, so that once that we have analyzed the risk factors, we're able to translate them into concrete proposals and solutions, no? But also about, once we start in that process of translating, we need to also frame ourselves in some general principles. And that is basically that any type of action that we promote to support UMCs needs to consider their most fundamental rights. Why? Because as I mentioned before, they're commitments by states enshrined at the EU or international human rights law level. So UMCs should be afforded and treated accordingly in relation to their most fundamental rights, such as education, the right to dignity, the right to health, etc. And here is where their migration status should not be a limit to provide that fundamental assistance when it comes to access to their fundamental rights. Now, all of these interventions, and that's the second principle on this slide, should be guided by the same principles. For example, participation that I mentioned before, no harm. Oftentimes, once again, there may be specific processes that we, as actors in this field, may be carrying out without realizing that we're actually creating further harm. When it comes to just one example, re-victimization by means of conducting interviews. So some of the UMCs, as we saw, they face violence, exploitation, and abuse in the migratory route. So sometimes when the assistance is being provided to them for specific services, we need to be mindful that if we need to request information about the experiences of violence that the child has suffered and has gone through, we should conduct this in a manner that, again, it's conducted in a safe environment, but also that doesn't require him or her to repeat oftentimes to different stakeholders the same situation. And this is one of the main issues that we see, unfortunately, when it comes to case management. But it's just one to highlight the no-harm principle in a more practical manner. Child-friendly interventions, and we often hear about how services should be provided in a child-friendly manner. And oftentimes, unfortunately, child-friendly interventions means that we need to start training, or we need to continue to train those working with children. We need to also look into the specific ethical standards of the entities involved. We need to also look into the safe spaces and safety conditions for children. We need to also think about the cosmovision and the vision of the child, particularly when they come from different cross-cultural settings. So let me just to give you one concrete example. We have experiences, very good experiences across the EU region, whereby when law enforcement officers are in contact with children, they have a specific focal points who have been trained on specific procedures, standards, etc. But also physically, they will not use military uniform, or they will not use their usual uniforms if they have to, because that condition, as you may think or you may know, may create not just some distinction or some separation from the child, but also because some of these UMCs may have seen authorities in countries of origin or transit or they have suffered violence, by these authorities. So all of these type of issues are very important to keep in mind. And sometimes, again, we may omit or we may just not really consider them, but they have, of course, a huge impact. Now, cooperation among key stakeholders, from an IOM perspective, we realize that, of course, there is not a single actor that can look into all of the specific needs in terms of support, but that there should be a link between all different actors. And in reality and in practice, it already happens, for example, in national protection mechanisms, national child protection mechanisms. However, what happens oftentimes is that even if the cooperation exists, the migration element or the understanding of migration issues is not embedded. And that translates, again, into different dimensions, some of which we have discussed today. And this is why it's also make sure not just the cooperation exists, but that it's that looks into these various dynamics as well. Share best practices, and I think this is a really good example of how we can do that. But I think very specifically, we're facing many times the same challenges, and solutions are already there. So it's not that we have to come up with new ideas or new proposals. Sometimes it's about adapting them, and I think this is a part of the of the work that IOM does about convening dialogue with different stakeholders. Because oftentimes there are already proven solutions and tested options, tools and resources that we need to just continue to further develop. And last but not least, accountability of relevant stakeholders. And accountability, of course, we're referring to the fact that we're accountable to the general public, but we're accountable to the children that we're being supported. So this is not, I mean, on the implementation level, this is not just about having their voice heard, but also making sure that there are responses to, in effect, that the information reaches out to them when they're being assisted, about also how they can launch complaints and what are the type of support and the legal remedies that they would be entitled to. Now, the main idea with this slide was to share with you some of the actions that we can promote to support the most basic needs and what to consider when conducting such a type of interventions and programming. Now, bringing this down even further down to more concrete examples of actions that we can do. So I'm going to share with you a few examples from an IOM perspective. And later on, I would like to hear also from your end about other activities and examples that you can share. But when it comes to the programming to support the needs of unaccompanied migrant children across this region, the European Union region, we conduct different interventions. So one of which looks at their most immediate needs of shelter, housing, education, access to integration services and support. So we have activities like this in Cyprus and Greece, just to mention two countries of others. And I'm sharing on the slide this example of the project Medina, which is a project that we implement together with the Greek authorities to safeguard children at border points. And basically, we are operating in 5 different islands, whereby we are basically supporting the state in their duty to provide access to children, the UMCs, to formal and non-formal education. So, for example, they also receive language courses, etc. With the final goal, of course, of contributing to their integration. We do a similar activity in Cyprus, focusing particularly on those transitioning to adulthood. So we have a program that looks into semi-independent living units. So this is an initiative that has been also carried out by others, but I'm speaking from an IOM perspective, that in this activity that we are also supporting the Cypriot authorities, we basically support that mechanism whereby children ages 16, 17, they are being supported in that transition period by allowing them and supporting them in living independently, making their own decisions, shaping their own understanding of the world to enter into the labor market, etc., etc. So it's really not let's say a family or household environment, as many will know, but an environment that looks again into these specific dimensions, because many of them, they also want this type of support. I was mentioning before that this is also why it's important to hear what they want and how we can convey that support, no? Because oftentimes at the end that might counteract exactly what we want to achieve and to aim altogether. So this is just one example of these activities at the individual level. So at the level, I'm translating also the assessment of the risk factors at the individual level, at the type of assistance that can be provided at the individual level. Now, if we look more at the community dimension that we saw before, one example of one activity that we do, we have done recently, is the case of Italy. So we have been supporting a number of activities over the past decades. But one that I just wanted to show very quickly is this toolbox that we have just recently launched. And it's a toolbox, which is the training package and training materials to train frontline workers who work with UMCs to detect sexual and gender-based violence and know how to react. So the toolbox has been piloted in reception structures, and also looks into how to coach UMCs on how to best cope with emotions linked to SGBV as they commence their integration into their new environment and make their transition into adulthood. So this has been carried out, as I mentioned, in the format of a training, a mindfulness-based training. But it's again one concrete example of this dimension of working with the children directly and also with those who have direct contact with them. Other two examples that I wanted to share, first of all, at the regional level. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I work at the regional office in Brussels, covering the European Economic Region. So together, and again, we have this tool that looks into dimensions at the EEA level, but also across the world in something which is called the Displacement Tracking Matrix, which is a tool that contributes to analyzing data to disseminate critical multi-layer information on the mobility, vulnerabilities, and needs of displacement of mobile populations. So a lot of the information that I have shared at the very beginning comes also from this displacement tracking matrix. And it's an open resource that is available for anyone who wants to understand dynamics of movement. So I shared examples of migration of UMCs, but you can find some other resources, and again, from some other regions. And just one last example that I wanted to share with you is the example from a regional perspective that we are just starting to implement as of this month. And this is a project whereby we're going to work on protection of children at borders. So we're going to start working with law enforcement, border management officials and frontline workers. So hopefully reach out to a number of stakeholders, of anyone contacting or having contact with children, either because you are UMCs or not. But the main idea will be to support these contact points in their roles of detecting vulnerabilities, detecting as well protection needs. So, for example, if at the line at the airport they see suspicious activities, and this happens when it comes to trafficking, for example, children who have been trafficked and are traveling with the traffickers. So how to detect and exploit the specific indicators of whether a child may be trafficked or not, but also the level of support and understanding about the cross-cultural dimension, about the need to have child-friendly spaces, even at airports, even at different centers, to understand a little bit that cosmovision of the child when it comes to their views when they are entering into contact with authorities. And overall, from that dynamic, try to better cope with the needs that they have, because we're also mindful that, and just in the case of law enforcement officials, border guards, sometimes they have to process, they have to conduct processes very quickly. So it doesn't give them also too much time to spot a lot or to really intervene when it's mostly needed, no? When it's particularly when they are at the entry points. In this project, what we'll do, it's not just look into the capacity building, but also look into practices across the EEA region that we can also share with other member states of what they're doing, because we want to also foster that dialogue in terms of what other member states can do to better work with children at borders. Now, these were just a few examples from practices implemented from IOM. I'm missing a few others when it comes to thematic guidance, combining dialogue, research, and awareness raising. So it's quite broad and quite vast, the work that we try to do in coordination with others. But overall, what you can find with us, and I'm happy to share more information right after this session, is a number of tools and resources on how to better support unaccompanied children. So I'm sharing a few of them on the slide. I will not go into detail, but these resources, including our handbook on the protection and assistance to migrants, vulnerable migrants, may also help you as well, for example, into adapting or reviewing your own processes. This handbook, the one that I'm sharing on the screen very briefly, looks into this model that I was mentioning before about providing assistance into these four different dimensions. And overall, I think one of the other messages that, of course, we're trying to convey in this handbook is the fact that UMCs, they are also resilient. So I've been talking about needs, I've been talking about risk, I've been talking about protective factors, because this is one of the ideas with this session. But we need to also frame the discussion when it comes to their protection on understanding how that process of migration has also contributed, when it has contributed to their growth, to their learning, to acquiring a certain level of understanding and views of the world. And therefore, how can we support them from there in their integration part? No? The resiliency they have because they have already experienced things that others may not experience at their own age. It's something that we also need to include, no? So overall, recognize that agency. And again, this is something that we can, of course, discuss in a different environment. Now, I will conclude in here to also give you time for your questions, but also I would like to hear more from your experiences as well and the challenges that maybe you are also encountering in your work. I'm including some questions for discussion. So very specifically about the obstacles and the gaps that you might have encountered in your experience, or even if you do not work with UMCs directly, that maybe you have heard, which are some practices, good practices, successful practices that you are implementing or that you might be aware of, which have contributed to support UMCs. And overall, what can we all do? Because as I mentioned very briefly before, at the end of the day, when we talk about these issues, we should really think about the different elements, about the specific interventions, no? How we all have a role to play on this. And I think that would be also an important part for our discussion. But maybe, and before I forget, before we get into the questions, I had a quick video because I think it would be also good to put a little bit of thinking, no, on the more visual part about the UMCs. So I'm going to share very quickly with you, and we will still have time for your questions, a video from one specific project that IOM has implemented. Yeah. And I'll come back to the questions in a minute. So apologies because I forgot I had the video before. So let me share my screen. But this video, very quickly, it's about a project that we have implemented a few years ago in different countries, including well, some of the activities also had an impact in Italy, and it's called Fostering Across Borders. So let me see if it works, and please bear with us with the technology here. Okay.
که زبان باز کنم از چه بخوانم من که مدفون زمانم چه بخوانم چه نخوانم چه بگویم سخنش که زهر است بکامم وای از اون مشت ستمگر که بکوبیده دهانم نیست شوقی که زبان باز کنم از چه بخوانم من که مدفون زمانم.
So, es gibt natürlich mit Renate auch viele schöne Sachen, zum Beispiel gemeinsam lernen, gemeinsam kochen, gemeinsam essen, gemeinsam reden miteinander, wir drei. Was machst du, Renate?
Ich trockne die Zwetschgen. Wie heißen denn die bei euch?
Bei uns heißt Alu Balu.
Auf Persisch Alu Balu?
Ja.
Und was macht ihr damit? Außer Essen?
Wir machen von dem Kishtar.
Kishtar?
Kishtar, ja.
Ist das sowas? Zeig dich starr auf Österreichisch.
Ja, zeig bitte.
So.
Ich bin sehr glücklich, wenn ich mit ihnen wohnen hier gemeinsam und mit Renate. Ja, die sind wirklich sehr fleißig, die verarbeitet viel und viel zu tun und ich wollte mitmachen. Eigentlich. Ja, seit einem Monat habe ich auch viele gemacht, auch in meine Deutschkurse gemacht.
Wenn du mal Profi bist, dann kannst du so umdrehen, ohne Stopp.
Ja.
Nicht drehen jetzt.
Wieso?
Du darfst nicht drehen. Stopp, immer in der Ecke stopp. Du musst immer schauen, wenn du ein bisschen nähst und schaust da unten, ob die Faden von unten auch okay ist.
Der Faden.
Der Faden. Danke.
Bitte?
Egal, jetzt musst du nicht durchlernen. Mein Leben in Afghanistan. Ja, habe ich Arbeit angefangen, 6 Jahre, 7 Jahre war ich. Und dann, ja, also als Schneider, Taschen machen, Rucksäcke und sowas. Das ist das Problem, was ich nicht schlafen kann, das ist meine Familie, Afghanistan. Halt, ich vermisse meine Familie sehr.
Öffnet die Blume ihre atemberaubend schöne Blüte.
Wenn es so schlecht geht, dann sie liest manchmal die Buch vom kleinen Prinz. Ja. Und dann schlafe ich so ein.
Wir sind gerade im Zug. Ich habe heute eine Prüfung. Ich bin gut vorbereitet ja, eigentlich. Mein bester Traum ist, mein bester Wunsch ist, dass ich eine Chemiker werden. Ja. Sie zeigt mir, wie ich meine Ziel erreichen kann. Sie hilft mir auch beim Sprache lernen. Und auch sie zeigt mir, wie ich schnell so studieren kann. Ja, und so eine solche Sache, sie hilft mir. Wow, das erste Mal, dass ich sowas sehe, Renate. Wirklich. Seit langem wollte ich sowas mal sehen.
Ganz ein gesundes Heilmittel. Wenn das gut wird, die Frisur, dann würde ich vorschlagen, dass du das Foto mitnimmst zum Bewerbungsgespräch. Ha?
Mhm.
Nächste Woche.
Ja.
Oh, Hilfe!
Box ist der einzige und Kickbox ist der einzige für mich in meinem Leben. Sie hat für mich eine Probetrainings organisiert. Das war sehr, sehr für mich gut. Und diesen Sport werde ich weiterentwickeln. Bis weit es geht. Weltmeister, Europameister, Champion in der Welt. Das ist mein Ziel, wie Tyson ist.
Und für die Blaue auf den Poussin begrüßen wir
Ja, jetzt leben wir da zusammen und uns geht es eigentlich gut. Ich kann sagen, mein Leben hat sich wesentlich verbessert. Es ist spannender, unterhaltsamer geworden, nicht mehr so eintönig. Es ist Leben ins Haus gekommen und das finde ich sehr schön.
Okay.
Jetzt nach 3 Jahren schau, wie das ausschaut alles.
Ja, ganz gleich, oder?
Ganz gleich, aber ich bin irgendwo anders. Ich habe dich getroffen, Deutsch gelernt, Sprache, Arbeiten, alles neu.
Ja, du kommst gut aus mit Schafen.
Ja, kann gut.
Hast du auch erlebt, wie die...
Seine Haare auch schneiden. So das war schon
Die Haare?
Deswegen, er ist Schneider
Friseur.
worden. Ja.
Also, du kannst die Haare,
Ja.
die Schafe scheren, heißt das?
Mhm. Das ist sehr
Und
schwierig. ist sehr schwierig.
Ja, weil die nicht ruhig
Wenn
sind,
du
die
zum
zappeln
Beispiel,
ja.
ja, und dann nicht so tief, weil die Haut von Schaf
Ja,
nicht
dass
schneiden.
sie nicht
Weißt du,
verletzt wird.
ja.
Ja. Es ist sowas Bereicherndes, Pflegemutter zu sein. Es ist wirklich eine Bereicherung in meinem Leben. Es ist natürlich auch Arbeit und Aufwand und Sorgen manchmal. Aber es ist ganz viel dabei mit Lachen und mit Herzlichkeit und mit etwas erfahren, was sonst eigentlich für mich nicht erfahrbar wäre.
Ich mag zum Beispiel sowas, Gedichte schreiben, weißt du? Musik geht nicht unser Leben. نیست شوقی که زبان باز کنم از چه بخوانم من که مدفون زمانم چه بخوانم چه نخوانم چه بگویم سخنش که زهر است بکامم وای از اون مشت ستمگر که بکوبیده دهانم نیست شوقی که زبان باز کنم از چه
Daniel? Hello?
Yes, sorry, just
okay. So first of all, thank you very much also for having shown us this video and taken us back to the lives of people, and it was nice after having talked about facts and numbers to go back to stories and lives of those involved with their experience. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your, of course, this lengthy presentation and the insight you've given us on this target group and the migration routes, and it was really interesting. And of course, there are more questions. I would first like to say, though, that of course you were talking about best practices and the importance of sharing best practices and maybe finding strengthening this network of I've heard civil society organizations and cooperation in general on the issue. And of course, I just would like to remind everyone that FA.B is actually aiming at strengthening cooperation and exploring best practices and promoting them and really improving also the qualification of local systems, because this is another major issue that you have mentioned, referring to the structural issues and structural, the policies and everything that as a pillar, a very central pillar in tackling the problem. So just to highlight that, of course, we believe that FA.B is in a way just a project, but is fully on this approach, comprehensive approach of also dealing with different aspects of this issue. So, but let's get on to the maybe questions that we have. I know that a few, or maybe one, has been written in the chat. So I don't know if you would like to, of course, give an insight. The first one was about the relocation trend. Can you tell us a bit more about this issue?
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Very quickly, so yes, so we continue to support the member states, EU member states, together with other partners of the UN system, but also EU institutions in the voluntary relocation scheme. So this is, for those of you who may not be familiar, this is from the intervention where IOM is involved. It's an activity that we have been implementing since last year, around the time that COVID started. And I would say that there are quite a number of lessons learned and quite a number of, let's say, actions that have been carried out to support the relocation, not just of minors, but other groups. So I'm happy to report as well on the project itself and the numbers. I'm not going to go in detail because I think I have shared quite a number of numbers with you today, but I'm going to write on the chat the link to our website in IOM Greece, where you can actually find the flyer with a description of the latest trends, and that would speak itself. But yes, I'm happy to take any other questions.
I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more on the gender differences, especially regarding, for example, it was quite striking to see the differences between Greece and the other countries that were taken into account. So that would be an interesting thing to explore.
Yes. So indeed, I mean, I think there's no specific pattern as we can see. No, I think one of the main issues that we see, and I think that's, I mean, the other day, for example, we were sharing some information about migration via the Western Balkans, and this is I'm just adding a different layer to say the following, that whereas I have shared information about migration from UMCs, we also have to know that many of the countries of nationality of the girls who are migrating are countries where, because of societal-based expectations, they may not be able to migrate by themselves. So how even these girls have migrated or not is also shaped by those communities of origin and family and societal expectations. Many of them are of these groups that I have shared. An important number of them, they actually are migrating to join family members already in Europe. So what I'm just trying also to flag very quickly on this is that unlike boys, many of them, and again, this is a generalization, of these girls will not migrate because they have a specific migration project. It's basically because it's linked or anchored to family members, it's linked or anchored to migrating with another, with a male companion, either because it's a close relative member or not. But this is also like in terms of how the gender shapes how these girls are migrating, which would be different. And again, I'm summarizing to exclude other examples, but this is also just to flag the situation. If I would have to go outside the EU region, and again, this is not a completely generalized issue. I mean, this is one that I'm flagging, but in other regions, I mean, I had experience working in other countries and in other regions of the world where you may have similar trends of women migrating as part of with a male companion, etc. But basically having their own migration project, no? And this will be more and more, including unaccompanied migrant children, girls. But again, these are not absolute figures.
Okay, thank you very much. And then another thing that was very striking was what you were referring to as course of the pandemic, the rise on online search related to child abuse and material and trafficking purpose and sexual exploitation. Are there any other, you think, specific developments that we will be seeing, noticing, related to the actual as results of the pandemic? Any?
Yeah. Yes, I think, I mean, indeed, and we're already seeing a few of them. I mean, there could be very quickly different elements when it comes to the opening of borders. I mean, I was just seeing a few figures this week, actually, whereby we see that, for example, the number of applications for asylum have increased over the past few months. So that has to do with different factors, including, once again, the reopening of borders. So in terms of mobility, as we are, again, starting, or states are starting to open the borders, I mean, there will be specific issues that we will encounter. When it comes to exploitation and the data that I was sharing is because during COVID, one of the big alerts that we started receiving from the very start of the pandemic, and maybe perhaps you also have heard about this, is also the increase of because of the lockdown conditions, domestic violence and abuse. So I guess all of these, in added to the future when it comes to the socio-economic perspective, may also pose some new challenges that I think maybe we will continue to face. Vaccination-wise, I mean, this is also an element that we keep discussing internally within IOM. I mean, in this context where we're looking at the booster already, at the third vaccination, whereas in some other countries, they're not even covering 10% of the population with the first doses, no? And how this has a trickle impact, of course, in different dimensions, no? When it comes to the future of the pandemic, when it comes also to the recovery phase that we've been talking for quite some time as well. So again, it's very, whereas we see trends, I think it's still unclear, but definitely the COVID, the start of the pandemic has given us this specific diagram when it comes to some exacerbated conditions that lockdown and other measures. And again, I'm not criticizing lockdown. I'm just saying that this is part of the elements, no, on how they have impacted UMCs, victims of trafficking, survivors of GBV, etc. No, and we will continue to experience the same. The last, I think, it's also in the public speech that we are all coping with the pandemic. And I think unfortunately, as we see peaks on the increased xenophobia and discrimination, if in the recovery phase, if I can use that word, but in the recovery phase, we also start looking into migration as the scapegoat, which unfortunately many times is used as the scapegoat for political reasons and other reasons. So of course, this is also a direct impact. And we saw it also during the pandemic, at the start of the pandemic, when, for example, in some contexts, migrants were being blamed for as carriers of the disease, no? But this is unfortunately not new. I mean, we saw it in 2009 as well, with the avian flu pandemic as well. In international mobility, as we all know, does not discriminate based on passport or nationality. This is an issue of public health. So unless we work towards combating that misperception and misunderstanding, then I think it's very difficult and it will continue to be very challenging.
Definitely, absolutely. And it is going to be challenging in any case, yes. And one last thing maybe is we know the challenges. I mean, we have had some international also exchange experiences also among the partnership and have learned more about each other's systems, reception systems. So we had, of course, we have learned the numbers in terms of arrivals, but then the reception systems are, of course, very important in terms of the quality of the stay of has a direct effect on unaccompanied migrants in terms of course, their lives, their future lives. And I don't know, it's definitely important to learn more about each other, but also at a European level to be able to of course, know more about the individual systems, learn more, and also have some international organizations, for example, of course, supporting this activity in terms of exchanging and knowledge, acquire of knowledge.
No, definitely, and I think from an IOM perspective, I mean, this is, I think this is the positive, let's say, element of working with at different streams with member states, migrants, private sector, civil society, academia, etc. I mean, I have mentioned before that all of the issues that we have been talking about and climate change and many others, of course, they cannot be tackled by one partner. I think this is also the complexity of migration. I mean, you may think, or you may know that even for us, when we speak to national counterparts, we don't speak to one Minister of Migration. We speak to the Ministry of Labor, we speak to the Ministry of Interior or Health, etc. From the positive element, the solutions are within multiple partners. The challenge, of course, is the coordination among all of us. And I don't mean only national authorities. I mean, even I can tell you from the UN system, the coordination that we have among our agencies, the coordination that we have with civil society with us, the coordination where we have not to basically to use the resources that we have, and they will continue to be very limited in the future. I mean, as we've seen it, to try to do the best, because I think in this, I mean, going back to the point of reception, I mean, we understand that there are challenges. I mean, we have been there trying to support member states when it comes to reception support. We know the challenges that we have, for example, to appoint guardians. We have the challenges also when it comes to quality guardians, you know, all of these issues. I think there are positive developments, and I think this project is one of them, about bringing and contributing to that joint construction. I think we will definitely need more in the future. We will need to continue this discussion. Many times we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg. But again, I think the challenges will remain there, and we also have to be accountable. And we should hold accountable those who are responsible for it, because at the end of the day, our contribution is to the fulfillment of their work, of their road, no? So I would say that yeah, the challenges are there, reception conditions, especially for UMCs. Some countries were talking about providing them with the minimum dignified conditions, living conditions. I like to say that we should also combat the public discourse that sometimes some individuals start saying, oh, they're treated better than nationals. And in reality, when you see reception support conditions, is not the same, no? It's really the minimum that they should be afforded. And actually some member states, and that's a good positive element, they do. Sometimes they don't, and they don't. We should understand the why, support them, but also keep them and remind them and work with them to make sure that they make effective that type of relevant assistance.
Okay, thank you very much. As we say, the project claim, everyone deserves affection and support in growing into adulthood. So we just would like to remind everyone of the importance of such thing. I just would like to add that, of course, this was a webinar number 2, but there are others on the way, and they will all be uploaded on the website of the project, fabtogether.net, for professionals and anyone interested in learning more about the subject. Daniel, thanks again for the very interesting your intervention. Thank you very much.
No, thank you as well for the opportunity, and I remain available in case there are any questions or in case you want any further information.
Thanks. Goodbye then.